This video is going to look at reporting psychological conventions. So the AQA specification clearly shows that pupils must demonstrate knowledge and understanding of reporting psychological conventions. They must know the sections of a scientific report. You must know the structure and the function, sort of the what and the why of each of these sections. And you may be asked even to write an example of any one of these sections. So you may be asked to write an example method section or results section, and referencing is a common one that comes up as well. So you may be asked about any of these sections of a psychological report. And the AQA specification makes it really, really clear that students have to have written and conducted research and then followed up with a written psychological report. And so part of the A-level is actually conducting this research. So it's really important that you then know how to report on your findings. Okay, so just a general overview of the different sections of a psychological report. So we can see it's always going to follow this order. In fact, we're going to have a title at the top there, and that's going to be on its own page, and we'll talk about the title in just a moment. We then have the abstract. Now, this is a brief summary. You can think of it as a bit of a blurb, and this provides an overview of your research, followed by the introduction, which is kind of a bit of background reading. It's your literature review, it's the prior research that's being conducted, and it's a way to clearly define and explain all of the key terms and concepts that are necessary for your report, and that's how we then present our hypotheses. Our method, so we've got different sections for the method: design, participants, materials, and procedure. So we'll look at those. Our results, now we need to include descriptive statistics, so things like our mean, median, mode, range, standard deviation, and then also our inferential statistics as well, so our reporting of levels of significance and our use of a statistical test. We then have our discussion, which is where we discuss our findings. So we report our findings in reference to our hypothesis and in reference to previous research. We discuss the strengths and weaknesses of our design. We suggest improvements for future research and the wider implications and applications of our findings. And then we have our references. So we have to provide details of all of our source material, particularly what was mentioned in our introduction. And it all has to be written in the APA format, the American Psychiatric Association's format. Psychological Association format, sorry. Okay, so just some words quickly on style. So the key thing to remember is that this is an academic piece of writing. And so it's not your personal opinion. We avoid personal pronouns. It needs to be academic and scientific. And the purpose is to communicate. And so that means that we need to sort of avoid overly technical language. Of course, we need to define all of our key terms, but we need to write it in a simple way that's going to appeal to non-experts as well. But on the other hand, we don't want to be too casual either. This is academic, and that needs to be presented in our writing. We must be objective, it must be correct, it must be clearly written, it must be accurate, all of the above. It's pretty succinct, so we need to be economical with text. So we typically write things in a really succinct way. We don't write things in an overly complicated language, and we don't over-explain things, we just get to the point. We never say prove. Things aren't proven. Things are supported by the research. We're never dealing with certainty, we're always dealing with probability. That's why we use p-values, so we can never prove our hypothesis. We can support one instead. Another style guide is just that the title, abstract, and the references sections, they're on their own pages. Everything else just follows on from this previous section. But title, abstract, and references need to have their own dedicated pages. The method, so the abstract, method, results, discussion, and references, they have a title before them. But your introduction doesn't. You just have your title on your first page. You have your abstract on the next page with a title. And then you have your introduction, but with no title on the introduction. And then we move on to our method, results, discussion, etc. Okay, so let's jump into each of those sections. Let's start with the title. So this is the first page of our report. Our title is succinct, so it's approximately 15 words. Anywhere between 10 and 20 words is okay. What we're trying to do is state our operationalized variables, but without it being too wordy and too complicated. So here, hopefully you will recognize from these titles, these studies that you've learned about in the A-level spec. Reconstruction of automobile destruction, an example of the interaction between language and memory. You'll recognise that as Loftus's research on leading questions. Attachment, exploration and separation, illustrated by the behaviour of 1-year-olds in a strange situation. You should recognise that as the title of Ainsworth's original strange situation research, and study of prisoner and guards in a simulated prison. So we just get to the point, and we provide our sort of a summary of our variables there. Okay, on the next page, we include our abstract. Now, our abstract is the first section that appears in the report after the title, but it's the last section that's written. And the reason for that is that, it provides a summary of all of the other sections. So you need to have written all of the other sections before you write the abstract. So it's a brief summary. It's around 150 to 200 words long, and you basically dedicate one sentence or so to each of the following. So the aim of your research, the method and design, including details about the sample and the participants that were included, your results, your findings, not your statistical results, but just a general overview of what was found and any conclusions that you drew. So the purpose of the abstract is basically to give readers an idea of what your paper is about. You will know from your own research that any sort of scientific report is typically behind a paywall, and so you want to know that the research is relevant to you before you dish out the cash to actually buy access to the paper. So it's kind of a summary, it's a mini version of your paper. It gives people an overview of what your study's about. Here's an example. This is obviously from Rutter's Romanian orphan study, so I'd recommend just pausing the video and seeing where you can identify the aims, the methods, the sample, the results, and any conclusions as well. Next we have the introduction. So your introduction is worth approximately a third of your report. So a third of your writing should really be dedicated to your introduction. The function of the introduction is to make it really, really clear what the objective of your research is. And we use what's called sort of the inverted triangle or the funnel technique. So generally your introduction starts really broad and then becomes more and more specific and targeted towards your specific research. And a good test of whether you've succeeded in writing a good introduction is to ask yourself whether the reader could predict what your hypotheses are going to be after reading all of your background review. So have you sort of piqued in your reader's mind their curiosity and identified what the research question is, what the gap in the literature is, so that it's logical then where your study actually fits into the broader picture. So we use this funnel technique. We start off really, really generally. So, for example, our opening sentence would be defining sort of key terms, introducing your reader to the general topic or the problem. So, for example, cognition and development or cognitive development or schemas, for example. Just providing, a general intro into the theory. Then we start getting a little bit more specific. So we use this funneling process. So we're starting to get a little bit more specific. This is where we're maybe defining key terms and concepts that are a little bit more specific to the study at hand. Then we want to summarize previous research findings. So what other studies have been conducted, what's been found. Then we introduce our study, so the aims and the rationale. So is there a gap in the literature, or are we doing a replication study? Why this study? And then we finish with our hypotheses. So we need to include our research and our null hypotheses here. We say it is hypothesized that, and here we say the aim of the present study is to. Okay, we then move on to the method section. Now the method section, we typically, although not exclusively, but we typically have 4 subheadings here to represent the 4 subsections, but not all research is going to have all 4 of them there. So we start off with the design. So this is where we provide details about the experimental design and the type of experiment that's being conducted. We'll state what our IV and DV are, and we'll state our levels or the conditions of the IV, and also how participants were allocated into those conditions. We might talk about controls for extraneous variables. For example, if we did a repeated measures design, we might talk about counterbalancing and how we counterbalanced participants there. What was our process for sorting them into A, B, for example. And there might be justification for our choices. So if we chose an unusual design, or if, say, it was unethical to perform a lab experiment, we had to take advantage of a natural experiment, then we would justify why that's the case there. We then talk about our participants. So in our participant section, we want to talk about our target population. So where are our participants drawn from? We want to talk about the number in our sample. And we also want to talk about sort of any demographic information that might be relevant for this particular study as well. We typically report on sort of the numbers of men and women, or boys and girls in the study. So we just want to give people an idea of who exactly was studied. We might say something like the participants were 130 female secondary school students of a Melbourne grammar school who were selected via convenient sampling. So we want to talk about the sampling method. If we've got allocation, we might want to discuss the allocation method. If there was payment involved or an advertisement that was published, we want to give details of where it was published and for how long, for example. Any exclusion criteria, who was discounted, who was turned away, and why, so that if there is any bias, we're reporting that to our readers. We might discuss some ethics here as well. Ethics can come up at a few different points, and this is one of them. Particularly if we're talking about, say, informed consent. If we were dealing with underage participants, I wanted to give some information about how they were recruited and what controls were in place to ensure that ethics was adhered to. That's what we would discuss there too. So we need to basically ensure that we provide enough detail in this method section so that our research can be replicated precisely. So it really does need to read a little bit like a recipe, like outlining your ingredients and your rationale and your steps. The other parts of the method include the materials and the apparatus. So we don't need to say things like pen and piece of paper. Typically we're talking about, if we've created a new questionnaire or we're using a well-known inventory or something, then we would state that that's what we're using. And any other materials that are necessary for replication. Obviously, if you're recording results, you're going to use a paper and pen to do so, or a computer, but you don't need to really list out those unnecessary materials. The procedure, think about this like the instructions for a recipe. So we need to make it really, really clear exactly what participants experienced in this experiment. So every process from when the participant arrives to when they leave. And it's kind of slanted towards the participant's perspective rather than the researchers. So it's really, outlining their experience. We don't need to talk about what happened, what the researcher had for breakfast that morning, or what happened before the participant entered the room. It's mostly from when the study begins for the participant. We might want to include instructions of what was said to participants, what briefing or informed consent then was given, any standardized instructions. We might want to quote what they were told. And if they were debriefed and what was said or what was provided in the debriefing. So this is another opportunity where we can include discussion of ethics. Okay, we then get to our results section, and the results takes a few different forms and has to fulfill a few different tasks. So it basically needs to present the findings and summarize it, and it also needs to analyze it, so that we can make inferences about the hypothesis. So we typically involve both descriptive and inferential statistics. So we would describe the pattern of the results. We would discuss our measures of central tendency and measures of dispersion. We would include a table. Now, this wouldn't be raw data. This would be a summary table. And typically a graph, like a bar chart, showing that in a pictorial form. In terms of inferential statistics, well, it's what you guys have been working on, writing about statements of results. So you might perform a specific statistical test, like a sign test or a chi-squared test, and then you would say the findings are significant when p equals 0, n equals using a two-tailed, etc., etc. Therefore, the experimental hypothesis is supported. And so refer back to your notes on how we discuss inferential statistics. Here's an example from a study. So we can see that we've got a summary table. This isn't raw data from participants. This is summarizing the mean and standard deviations of male and female participants in congruent and incongruent conditions. We can see the same data represented in a bar chart here, and we can see a statement of inferential statistics written as well. Just a reminder that results are never significant or insignificant. There's either a significant difference or there's not, a significant correlation or there's not. And of course, we never say insignificant. We always use the phrase non-significant. If your research involved qualitative data, so if it involved, say, a content analysis or analysis of interview transcripts, for example, then we need to provide the themes and the categories that were used when analysing. Okay, we then move on to our discussion. So the discussion section follows immediately after your results section, and this makes up about another third of your report. So it's about similar in length to your introduction, and it's of similar importance. And this is where we discuss our results. So after we've presented our results in the previous section, we're now in a position to sort of evaluate and interpret their implications, particularly in reference to our hypothesis. So this is where we interpret the results. This is where we draw conclusions about them, and we talk about sort of the practical consequences of the results. So it works like this. We restate our hypothesis or hypotheses. We then summarize our findings. Now we talk about it in words rather than talking about it in terms of like a statistical statement like this. We now talk about it in just normal everyday language. What has been found? What does this show? We link this back to our hypothesis. So this is where we state whether which hypothesis is supported or rejected. We then link this to previous research. So the research that we outlined in our introduction, we then want to say whether our research is consistent with it or whether it differs, and a discussion of why we think that is. We want to then provide basically a discussion of our own methodology. And this is where you guys are really good because you're used to criticizing studies. And so we need to identify the strengths of our study and also the limitations. So if there were issues with the materials used or with the experimental design, if there are extraneous variables, what was the problem? What effect did that have on the results? And then how do we improve it? So what are your suggestions for addressing these limitations? How could we expand this research further? So we might make recommendations saying, well, next time we should include another experimental condition and they would be exposed to X, for example. So where can we go with the research in the future? And also the wider implications on policy, on society, on education. What does this mean and why does it matter? So we're basically trying to convince the reader here that the study was worthwhile and adds to the body of literature on this topic. We want to end with sort of a punchy statement, just a punchy conclusion, something that, just sort of summarises the broader area of study, makes a lasting impression on the reader to show that this study was really important and found something that is worthwhile. Then we have our references. Guys, this gets asked quite a lot in exams. Quite often they will give you details about a book or a journal article, and then you need to put it in correct APA referencing style. APA referencing style looks like this for a journal or a book. So we always have the surname first. If there are two, then we include both of them. So surname, comma, first initial, full stop. We then include the year that it was published, followed by the title, followed by the name of the journal that it was published in, followed by the volume number, and then the issue number, and then the page range. If it's a book, it's a similar style, but just a little bit different. So we still have the surname and the first initial, followed by the year, the name of the book, and then the place of the publishing house. It could be London, here it's East Essex, UK, and then we have the name of the publishing house. So it's a little bit simpler. Usually in exams, they'll give you a book. Okay. finally, we have the appendix. This is where we put everything else that doesn't really fit into the body of the report. So if we created a questionnaire, we'd want to include a copy of it there. If we had standardized instructions, if we had a consent form, if we have raw data that we want to include but doesn't really fit in our report, in our results section, we include it there in our appendix. Anything else that doesn't fit in the rest of the report.